Nice.
Cool. So we'll get going in. I'll give it another 30 seconds here to a minute, and I appreciate everybody kind of jumping on. This will be a lot of fun. And you guys are doing well, Andy and Nick?
Yeah, man. Just picking up the pieces.
Yeah.
Turns out when you have an event with no fans, breakdown goes a lot quicker than normal.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
6 weeks turns into about 10 days.
All right, so we'll get started here. I appreciate everybody making it. I wanted to welcome you to our Lend Live. I used to do these interviews not live on just our general blog post, and I thought I'd kind of reinvent this, and thought this was a good time. So I'm Chris Carver. I'm Lend's co-founder and CEO, and I just wanted to thank everybody for being here today. And before I begin, I wanted to give a major shout out to our engineering team for creating this whole platform. It's given us an opportunity to really kind of take this to the next level and try to educate the folks that we really enjoy talking to on a daily basis about what everybody's doing. So we'll actually be taking this to market here pretty soon, but I'm excited to see what people do with it, from training volunteers to webinars to interviews to fundraising events to conferences, sponsor engagement. I'm really excited to see what people do with all of this. So this interview historically has been a part of our technology and operational series, and before we get going, before I introduce our guests, I just wanted to call attention to the right hand side of this webinar. You'll see kind of a chat section. Feel free to go in and if you want, introduce yourself. There's some really cool people that have registered and are attending. It's been always great to talk to each one of you. So I know you have a lot to share. And if you have some thoughts or ideas, definitely add it to the chat. And then if you have any questions, feel free to add that to Q&A. I know some folks have already sent me some questions, so I'm excited to get to that towards the end here. So I thought this interview would be a lot of fun. Last weekend, for those that don't know, but I'm sure most of you do now, we had the Farmers Insurance Open here in San Diego. And I reached out to Andy and Nick. Obviously we have a working relationship, and thought this would be fun because we're now almost a year into this pandemic, and I thought it'd be a unique opportunity just to sit down and do almost a post-event operational recap from the event last week. And so before we jump into that, I definitely wanted to introduce you to these two. Andy Hermatis is the SVP of Tournament Affairs and Events at the Century Club, which puts on the Farmers Insurance Open, which Andy will talk about in a minute. And Nick Schling is the Director of Operations for the team there. So Andy and Nick, if you don't mind, do you mind taking a moment to talk about what your role entails and potentially how that's changed throughout all of this?
Yeah, sure. Basically oversee everything for the event, all sides of it. So the overall execution, and then Nick is part of the operational team. I don't know how much it evolved. It was really getting back to kind of the basics, because it was like a brand new event. So, I mean, even for me, it was not having all those hands on deck that we normally had. It was even going back to sitting down and getting retrained and learning how to drive a forklift again, and being out there, really being hands-on, something that I haven't done in a couple of years. I'm just using my pointer finger now. So that was different in that regard. But it was really spending a lot more time with the county and the city, if anything. Normally we have a couple of touch points throughout the years, just making sure we're on track. Here's your checklist, be done with it. But this year it was spending so much time with the county and the city. And outside of that too, spending a lot more time with our strategic partners, and just learning about how COVID had impacted them and their business, and how they could still support, and in some cases not support the event. I mean, I could use Scripps, who's our medical partner, year in and year out for as long as I can remember. because of what's going on with COVID, they couldn't even be a part of the event. They couldn't, they're stretched too thin. They couldn't lend any resources to the event, which then, Nick and I had to go out and find other avenues from a medical support standpoint. So just a lot of changes. Things were just different, basically just a brand new event starting over from scratch.
How about you, Nick?
So since Andy got on the forklift, I was able to continue to use my pointer finger this year, which was nice of him. Kidding aside, on a year in and year out, my main responsibility is just to oversee all of our operational partners, and that typically entails a build out that starts at the end of October and, equates to about 300,000 square foot of temporary flooring. This year that build date moved back and we didn't start building until New Year's Eve, really. And it was down to 20,000 square feet. So to Andy's point, it looked a lot different out there, along with that, just working on the overall security plan for the event. And so in addition to those, one thing I took on this year was really kind of being the internal COVID testing expert, if you will. And I definitely put quotes around the word expert there. But working with the PGA Tour and the testing program that they've had in place with Sanford Health since June, making sure that the way we were doing things on site fit with what the County of San Diego expected from a reporting standpoint, making sure that all the proper certifications were in place. And then in addition to that, we had a parallel testing program with a company called WorkCare out of Orange County that I also oversaw. So that was a big part of my time this year, was call it COVID compliance, if you will. And when I look back on the 2021 Farmers Open, what I will remember the most is the amount of phone calls that I sat on with doctors and nurses and epidemiologists talking about their field expertise and just doing my best to hold up my end of the conversation.
Yeah, your vocabulary definitely grew.
Epidemiologist is a good one. I'm going to keep that one in the repertoire.
I'm sure there's a lot to this answer, but when you think about the months leading up to the event, you mentioned one of the biggest hurdles was getting your operational plans improved. Andy, approved from whom? What were you doing there?
So we were working with a division of San Diego County, and really, let me take a step back. So anything that the state of California mandated basically was then interpreted by the San Diego County, which was then reflected onto the city of San Diego. So really everything was coming from the state, but is being interpreted by the county. And they had a division called OES, Office of Emergency Services. And we worked with a gentleman by the name of Gary Johnston, who basically held our hand through this whole entire process. And he was the direct liaison with the public health office and the public health official and Dr. Wilma Wooten. So everything that we did had to go through him, and then was shared with the public health office.
Got it.
So basically the approval came from the county, even though it was the mandate of the state.
Huh. And this is a broad question, but what was the process of developing that plan like?
I mean, it really started with you having to think through every single individual, different type of individual, what hat they're wearing, what role that they have at the event, and then really taking it start to finish, what their day looks like on any given day and what those physical touch points are. And then going back to what the state and county protocols and procedures were and applying it to that individual. So how does that fit into their day from the time they arrive on site to how they're eating and, basically from departing. So it just was every single person. And then not only on the competition days, but on the pro-am days, any event, just working that into it.
And Nick, I know you kind of talked a little bit about having to go as detailed down to what, player registration, catering is like, what they're going to eat, where they're going to go to the bathroom. I thought you had an interesting note earlier when we were talking about the restroom. So you want to even get down to that level of detail?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, going back to Andy's point, when we sat down to start writing this plan to present to the county. Really the way we looked at it is, let's start first thing in the morning. Let's identify this person, where they park, where are they being temperature screened, how are they being transported to their location on the golf course, where are they eating, and then where are they ultimately going to the restrooms. And, in a given year, we'll have anywhere from 25 to 30 locations on property where you can purchase food and beverage or get food and beverage through a voucher. And so as we talked about the Marshall that's on one green on the north course, there's typically a concession stand right there. There's no longer a concession stand there this year. So how are we going to make sure that individual has the opportunity to eat in the middle of the day? And then to your point on restrooms, typical year, we've got almost 300 temporary restrooms on property. That number stepped back to a little bit over 60. But what's interesting is the mandate that the county had of each restroom had to be sanitized and disinfected every 60 minutes. Our overall bill year over year is going to be very much the same because of the increased labor charge that we had, just to make sure that we were following the protocols that San Diego County laid out for us.
And I'm curious, with something as large as that, how many revisions did you have to go through throughout that process?
We really only had one major revision, and I think that's because we started so early with the OES, and basically we're transparent with everything. And hey, what do you want to see? What do you want it to be? Tell us how it ultimately needs to be put all together. So that way, when we came to them with it, there is no surprises, right? That we knew what we needed to provide to them, and what we needed to execute. So we submitted the first week in November our initial plan, which was roughly 75-80 pages. It took them about a week to review it. We set up a call in the third week, and by the fourth week, we were at a point that was just one sticking point left. So really, the whole approval process was under 30 days, probably about 25. But it really came down to kind of unique is that the last thing that they were waiting to approve the event on was actually masks for caddies. To them, it was a no-go unless caddies were going to wear masks. And the tour was not having that. So the conversation was had with the county. Well, hey, let's take you through, what it's like to be a professional caddy, because could you do this? And basically said, hey, can you walk 4.5 miles with a 55, 60-pound bag, right, over undulating property for 5.5 hours? And the response was no. So they don't have to wear masks. So, I mean, we really had to take it down to that level of detail to actually get something like that approved.
So when did that final approval come in?
So the final approval came in the 24th or 25th, roughly in that area of November. And we didn't get an actual official letter, but they said that official letter wasn't absolutely necessary. But we received a letter from the public health official, actually 120 or 119. But regardless of that letter, we still were approved at the end of November. So going into December, we knew where we stood.
And in talking with you guys earlier, you talked a bit about, some of the things that really made this work. Can you talk a little bit about your approach, what you think really worked, and what finally got you that pass from the county? Especially in one of the most strict states and counties in the country when it comes to some of this COVID.
Sure. I could jump in there. I think to reiterate Andy's point of the amount of work that we did before our first submittal, and I pulled this number this morning, Chris, in the month from when we started writing the plan to when we first submitted, between myself and a company by the name of Cornerstone Imaging that we work with to develop our on-course site maps, there was over 50 hours of CAD work done within that month to get the site plans to where they needed to be to get approval before that first submittal. And then, really, I think one thing that Andy and I talked about through the whole process is we need to be as transparent with the county as possible. And this is what we want to do. And one thing that was it was unique and challenging in and of itself is when we started writing our plan, San Diego was under tier 2 of the reopening phase. So we had the ability to have 25% capacity for indoor dining. And by the time we got to mid-December, we had fallen to tier 1, which was outdoor dining only. And then ultimately, as you know, we were under a stay-at-home order, so no outdoor dining. So just that challenge in and of itself, where our plan still had what would be considered outdoor dining in the plan for our volunteers, for caddies, players, media, vendors. And, ultimately what that transparency with the county led us to is, the gentleman that Andy mentioned earlier, Gary Johnston, working with us and saying, this is not a dining operation. This is not a dining experience. This is basically a food consumption tent. These are folks that are out there working, volunteering on your behalf, and they're getting the hour lunch break that they're deserved.
And
Wow.
you guys talked about something you did on I think it was the Tuesday of the advance week that was really, really helpful with the county. Can you walk through that and why?
Sure. So it was Tuesday, January 19th. Andy and I met with, approximately 15 to 20 people from both the city and the county of San Diego. And for many of these folks, as Andy mentioned earlier, our touch points with them throughout the year are not as extensive as they were this year. So many of them had never been to Torrey Pines. So it was literally taking them to the glider port, our main entrance for volunteers this year, and saying, okay, here's where they're going to park. This is the bike rack that leads them up to the credentialing trailer where they get their credential. Then they're going to get in the queue lines to go up to the temperature screening tent. After they get temperature screened, they'll go through the magnetometers and ultimately have their credential badge scanned to enter the event. And then it was taking them to the 5 locations on property where we had these food consumption tents and explaining the layout of these tents. Like, this is how the process will work. You walk up and get your food here. And then just the unique furniture layout that we had in our food consumption tents. So I know we're going to get into this a little bit later too, but every food consumption tent we had on site was a 30-inch by 30-inch low table with 1 chair at it. We had individual seating for everybody on property, and just, I think the opportunity to show the folks from the county everything that we had put in place, the health and safety signage we had around the property. I think that was just kind of the final piece that made them feel comfortable with everything they'd seen on paper.
Yeah, everything looked like a early 1900 single room schoolhouse. That's what it looked like. Big classroom.
Interesting. Because you had mentioned that the only context that the county had for a major event at this point during COVID was the MLB playoffs. And so walk through kind of the recalibration of their thinking and what you had to do there.
Well, I think it's all about managing expectation, right? So when we first started with them, the MLB playoffs were here in San Diego, and with working with the MLB, they started at a place to where working with a professional league was that each individual person, not just the athletes, but everyone in the front office, anyone in the building, was being tested every single day. And that's not how the PGA Tour was set up. You're basically tested once to get inside their bubble at the beginning of the week, and then you're supposed to do your due diligence and taking care of yourself and wearing a mask and physical distancing and all that. So we started at a place of an uphill battle because the bar had already been set that, okay, this was in town, this is what it probably should be. But the cost for that, to have all of those people tested every single day, just something that, for how our model is, just isn't feasible.
It was also educating the county, Chris, on the difference between the PGA Tour and Major League Baseball, where the MLB playoffs, when they came here, everybody was in San Diego until their team was eliminated. As you know, the PGA Tour is moving from city to city each week, so it's just a very, very different animal that they were looking at, and we just walked them through it and got them to a place where they felt comfortable.
And Nick, you talked a bit about that site map, and I thought it was really interesting to hear kind of how it evolved to really be an even better tool this year. Can you kind of talk about some of the details that you added to the site map and why that was helpful and the impact of that?
Sure. Yeah. So going back to the beginning of writing our health and safety plan and that initial phone call with the county before we even submitted the plan, it was, hey, we want to see down to the level of detail of where every 6-foot distancing sign is on property. We want to see every piece of bike rack. We want to see the directional traffic flow for folks when they park, and then ultimately how they walk to enter the property. So, and I mentioned the company we work with earlier, so it was hours and hours and hours spent on identifying every sign in every area that we had on property. It was showing the bike rack and exactly how the flow would go to get into the bike rack, queue lines, go up, get your food, go down into the tent, ultimately to the table you were going to sit at. And, that became something we had to do to get this plan approved. But ultimately, for folks, our operational partners that have been coming out here for years, everything was different on property. Volunteers were actually parking on site. They weren't taking a bus to the property. Where we had our main food consumption area for vendors and on-site personnel, that's typically our Michelob Ultra fan zone. So with everything moving around, those detailed site maps became extremely beneficial, going into really the final 2 weeks before
Awesome.
the tournament.
And you mentioned how important communication was. How did that change pre-event communication this year, and why was that so critical? I know it sounds obvious, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of have you talk through the details.
It was definitely different. I mean, we're used to, I can speak for like Nick and I and the rest of the staff, but we're used to all getting together, right? And getting into a war room and spreading out and going over topics and ideas and figuring things out. And we just had to learn how to use technology such as this to be able to communicate. I mean, there was times, from a fear standpoint of getting COVID and trying to be separate from everyone, we had it to where Nick and I would be in the same building 30 feet apart, but we're doing this, whether it was on Teams or Zooms or whatever it is. So it was really learning how to use, different platforms to communicate.
And, Chris, one thing that was really helpful, and as we really bolstered our credentialing system coming on board with you this year, and really leveraged that to the point of, the county came to us and said there's every single person on site needs to have a badge with a name and a photo. And it's very different for some groups on site. For example, in a given year, we'll print 250 generic CBS sports credentials, and it was going back to CBS and saying, we have to collect names, we have to collect photos, and doing that through the Lens system. One thing that the county and ultimately farmers required as well was that everybody sign a COVID waiver before they step on property, and really figuring out how to leverage the system you all have built to make that process as efficient and smooth as possible, because it was so different than how it would normally be.
And then can you walk through some of the communication nuances once you were on site?
Yeah, I mean, it was, to Andy's point earlier, and, so many of the operational partners that we bring into work to the event, they're not just vendors for us, right? A lot of these folks are good friends of Andy and I. So it's the normal, you show up on site and, we've got our operations center, and that really becomes like a hub for everybody to hang out and enjoy time together after the day. And that's just something that, Andy and I had to have those difficult conversations and say, this can't happen this year. We really, everything fell back on protecting the event and making sure the event could happen. And so because of that, it just changed some of what we were used to. And, when it came to be on site, it was a lot of what you see elsewhere, right? It was additional signage. Make sure you physical distance, make sure you have your mask on at all times, wash your hands thoroughly, but that signage was everywhere. And it wasn't just for tournament week. Those signs were in place before anybody really started coming on property. And then, there's just the interactions of reminding people, wear your mask. You've got the fence crew out here who's installing 700 linear feet of 10-foot fence, and that's a very laborious task. And I completely understand why they wouldn't want to wear a face covering, yet it was going around and making sure those folks were sticking
Because
to the guidelines.
you also, when we were talking, you mentioned how people get comfortable kind of once they get that past that first test or first day or two. There was a bit of self-policing, it sounded like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we basically put the onus on everyone to remind everyone else, like, hey, mask up. You know, don't forget, you know, that we're in a pandemic. So it was constant. You know, we saw it more, I think, from the traveling staff coming in from the PGA Tour that weren't abiding by it, as opposed to the local individuals that were here. So really, when we were back of house, we were around the operations center. Everyone was pretty adamant about it. You'd have some stragglers out on the golf course that you had to remind, and a couple of volunteers here and there. But to the most part, everyone did a really good job having
Awesome.
their mask on.
Awesome. And can you talk through about, you know, the shift that you really had to do around F&B? I'm sure it was pretty big, and I think some of the nuances would be really interesting to hear kind of how you dealt with that.
Sure. I mean, I can start with like player dining. I can start there. I mean, so we use the lodge, which is the hotel adjacent to Torrey Pines, for player F&B dining, and it was just such a different experience from what it had been. I mean, I spent weeks with myself and Erica on our team, really just going through what items had been available for player dining, and it, you know, just the experience, not even experience, food consumption, right? So it's basically, we couldn't even call it a grab and go. We had to call it a point and pack, because nothing was allowed to be grabbed by the individual. Everything had to be behind the glass partitions. So it was coming up with a whole new menu that was easy to be, you know, packed up, put in an eggshell container and taken out. So we actually started at a place to where the professional athletes could not eat inside. We had a contingency plan that if it was raining, windy, we could end up there, but we couldn't start there. We did end up using that contingency plan, but really everything had to be point and pack and had to be taken out onto the terrace and the patios in and around the lodge. And it was for players only. And that's one thing that was extremely different too. You know, for the event, the state and the county didn't deem families, wives, girlfriends, friends, entourages essential. So it was players only. So we had to also ensure, because that was part of the tour's bubble, the players, that nobody else was coming into that area at the lodge. So one thing we had to do this year that, to my understanding, hasn't been done at any other co-sanctioned event, is that we got permission from the PGA Tour to actually scan their credentials. And we worked with Ticketmaster to get their numbers into our scanners, and basically to ensure that we had complete control of that area. We actually scanned the professional athlete before they went into the dining area, which was, going into that, as like, how is this going to be received? I mean, normally they walk around without any identification. Nobody stops them. They go where they want to go. But they were great. Nobody complained at all. Everyone understood. And, you know, we scanned all of them. We collected all of that data, and it's going to benefit us in future years.
Got it.
And I can speak to really the remaining key stakeholders on property. So the caddies, volunteers, and then media and the additional vendors and on-site personnel. So, and when we really sat down and started brainstorming how to feed everybody on property, Andy and I's mind went directly to, we need to have one food location, one hub where all on-site personnel can go to get food and beverage, because from a cost standpoint, that was going to make by far the most sense. But as we really started to lay it out in terms of how we could distance people, how we could keep lines moving through, what we ended up landing at was a separate area for volunteers, for caddies, for media, and then for vendors and additional on-site personnel. Really, when you would walk up to one of these areas, you know, we had over a mile of barricades, spike rack on property this year to create queue lines, whether that be for temperature screening or for these food consumption areas. And it was really, you know, designing those areas to be able to queue 40, 50 people at one time and make sure that everybody's distancing. And then when you get up to the tent, and Andy touched on earlier, all of the plexiglass screens that we had to have installed on our counters. And, it's very different for volunteers and for media. They're used to going up to a buffet and taking what they want and putting it on their plate. They're used to opening the cooler and taking a water or soda. All of that was done back of house behind the counter this year. And so the way that we designed the menus was to make it as quick and as efficient as possible. So it's when you walk up, you basically got the choice of, the hot entree or the sandwich of the day. And along with that, you automatically get 3 sides that are included with that. So it was really bolstering what a voucher gave you, but allowing for a very efficient process once somebody got up to that tent. I touched on a little bit earlier, just the seating setup in these food consumption tents. And the number I grab is we had an 82 by 82 open air tent for volunteers, and there was 169 30-inch by 30-inch tables. I mean, it was wild when you would walk in there, just a different layout than we're used to seeing. And, one thing that came into play with that, and one of our biggest challenges, through November, December, January, as everybody saw from some of the weather that we had at Torrey Pines last week, it can be very cold, you can have rain, you can even have hail. So how do we create while we call them food consumption tents, a suitable experience for our volunteers, for caddies, for media? And so one of the things that we worked very closely with the county on, and this goes back to the transparency that we used with the Office of Emergency Services, is, we understand that by the letter of the law, we can only have one sidewall up on a tent. And this is something we really worked through in that walk around with the county is, we've got to find a way to create somewhat of a climate controlled environment. So what that allowed us to do is have more flexibility with tent walls while keeping them open air tents, and ultimately finding a way to pump some heat into the space so that people actually felt okay taking off their gloves to eat their breakfast burrito.
And yeah, before I jump into another question, I was going to take a question from Jamie Blackerby. She asked, can you walk through what the COVID testing protocols were and who was required to test, how often, what kind of tests? Obviously, that can be, I'm sure, a very long, detailed answer. But what I thought was interesting for you guys is you had to run 2 parallel testing procedures, right? Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure. So, back in June when the PGA Tour restarted their season, they stood up a partnership with Sanford Health, and it's basically been, they've got a mobile testing truck that goes from event to event. Each event has to set up basically a COVID testing compound, with 2 registration tents, 4 testing tents, and then a result confirmation tent. And this, the tour's testing program is really intended to surround what they call the player caddy bubble. So it's gonna, each week, all players, all caddies are going to be tested, and then, ballpark the tournaments. So the Century Club, in our case, had, approximately 100 to 120 additional tests that we could allocate among tournament personnel, if you will. So really that becomes, Andy talked about the lodge with player dining. So it was the lodge staff that would operate player dining. It was our catering staff that operated caddy dining. It was our volunteers who operated our 10T player shuttle. It was our volunteers who were on standby for course evacuation in case we needed to get the players off the course in vans. And then it was, 10 to 15 additional staff members on our side, some of the lead security folks, Andy, myself, Marty. So really how the PGA Tour looks at it is, if you're going to be within an enclosed space with a player for more than 15 minutes in a 24-hour time period, that would basically identify you as somebody that needed to be tested through their program in the bubble, basically what you would consider all access at normal events. If you were not tested, not in that bubble, there were just certain areas on property that you did not have access to this year. And then, I touched on a little bit earlier, the local testing solution that we came up with was partnering with a company called WorkCare. And really for us, we had, still a Monday and a Wednesday pro-am. And per the PGA Tour's guidelines, all Monday and Wednesday pro-am participants had to be tested. So we stood up this program with WorkCare specifically to test our Monday and Wednesday pro-am participants. But as we got closer, started thinking, identifying, well, we should really, for example, have all our tournament staff tested before everybody moves on site and they're working in close quarters. So our program with work care really expanded, to the point of, Chris, we've talked before, Andy and I are fortunate enough to bring in, 8 to 10 additional operations professionals to assist us during the event. It was having those folks tested before they got on an airplane. And then once they flew into town, it was having them tested again on site. So that program with work care really grew, but that was more at the discretion of the Century Club, if you will, on what additional folks we wanted to have tested up and above what the
Yeah, and
PGA
then there
Tour
was
was
also,
providing.
you'd have a bubble inside the bubble. For instance, CBS, right? So to go inside the broadcast compound, that was a whole different test. And you had to be tested here locally, offsite, not on the property. And then to enter their bubble, you had to be tested every four days. So we were actually tested twice just to go inside CBS's area.
Oh, wow.
So both Andy and I were tested 5 times within a 10-day period by 3 different companies. So we feel pretty good about where we're sitting right now.
So was there any part of the process that didn't really work in practice that you had planned? Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought that was interesting.
Not ideal to have multiple different COVID testing programs on one property. Now that was a bit of a challenge, and really not even so much on site, Chris, in terms of, we had our COVID testing through the PGA Tour, and our Pro-Am COVID testing were literally 100 yards apart. So just ensuring that the right folks made it to the right tent to get tested by the right company was a challenge in and of itself. But really, it was more so on the front end with what San Diego County requires in terms of making sure the reporting of both positive and negative tests is fed into the county portal and the county system, how it's supposed to be. I mentioned earlier the multiple phone calls I sat on with folks that are a lot smarter than I when it comes to this. There was, basically I had a phone call with 4 epidemiologists at work under the Health and Human Services Division for San Diego County. And it was really educating me on the different ways that these individual companies could feed the reports into the system, and ultimately identifying what was most beneficial for San Diego County based on what Sanford Health, Work Care, and ultimately MedCore could provide. So definitely the parallel testing programs was a challenge. And then I would say, something you don't think about, and leading up to Torrey Pines with the temperature screening program that the PGA Tour has had in place, they always require a fan at each temperature screening tent, because they started this program back in the summer, and what you were running into is people would screen hot just because it was 98 degrees outside. We had the opposite problem where it was 45 degrees outside in the morning, and actually on Tuesday of tournament week, I walked up to a temperature screening tent, and the device actually would not work because it was so cold. So having to basically reshuffle the program, add some space heaters so that we could make sure our temperature screening devices were working in time for gates to open.
That's something too that, the tour, PGA Tour is going to discontinue thermal screening after the Genesis Invitational here in a couple of weeks up in LA, because they're finding them to be so unreliable and so all over the map. So it'll be interesting to see when the league says, hey, we're not doing this anymore, this isn't required anymore, but what will the state and county say?
Got it. And I want to jump to another question. Charlie Howe from the USGA, asked, understanding that, sign off was on the plan on paper, did you have any follow-up or critique from the county during the actual week? And what was that like?
No, they did not come out outside an F&B standpoint, like outside of that standard, what they would go through from a health and safety, like kitchen, back of house, prep area. Outside of that, no. Once they came on site on that Tuesday and we did that walkthrough with that massive group of individuals, that was the final sign off, and that came in the form of an email of, hey, everything we saw is basically to spec. What you're delivering on what you said you would, so you're good to go. But they never came back out during the week to really inspect anything.
Got it.
I'm sure, they were very concerned about optics. They said it over and over again. So they were very worried about social media. And let's say someone is capturing that on Instagram or Twitter, and then there's a picture of someone, eating food, right, without a mask on or something along those lines. Just catching them in that awkward moment, right, that they would, that then come out because of that.
Yeah, you guys mentioned you went so far as making sure that people weren't kind of bunching up even around the holes, even though they were outside and all that, right? So you had signs.
Yeah, we had signs, but there was also constant texting, emailing, sending out communication with Len, just reminding everyone, especially on Sunday as we were coming down to the last, three holes, making sure that, once people were done, volunteers were done on their hole, let's say, hey, you're off shift now on 15, you weren't moving to 16, then 15 and 16 weren't moving to 17. So by the time we got to 18, we didn't want to have this large, massive group. So we actually called a security meeting on midday on Sunday and got the roping and staking team, private security, the PD, PGA Tour rules officials all together and talked about what our plan would be in and around 18 as we came down to the final hole.
Got it. And what processes, procedures, tech do you think will stick around, even after all of this is kind of, gone or we figured it out?
Yeah, I'll say the hours and the time that we put into the detailed site maps is definitely, it was, as I mentioned earlier, hugely beneficial to everybody on property and something we'll continue to do, mainly because going into 2022, everything will change again, right? Where, at least I hope so, that we're not setting up an event that's set up in the same way as 2021. So, I think definitely that's sticking around. Also I would say some of the things we ran into on site was, we've got our magnetometers, right, that we've had for years at every entrance point to screen individuals before they come on property. But in a time like COVID, folks aren't necessarily comfortable putting their items into a container, somebody else touching them and then getting them back. So, we had to make kind of an on-site adjustment change to how people would go through the screening process and just, exploring some of the new walkthrough scanners that are out there to really eliminate those touch points.
I think the badge work that we did is going to continue on too. I mean, really never going back to having any sort of generic badges. I think that'll definitely stay. And also the ability to scan PGA Tour badges for us, and people who are on the call won't understand it, but it's the PGA Tour has its own set of credentials that are, year-long credentials that work at any PGA Tour event. And then we have our own set of credentials and our own set of badges. And you basically have these two offsetting types of badges that they don't communicate, and they're provided by different groups for different individuals. So for us to be able to actually capture all that information and know who's exactly on property, when and where, I don't think that's going to go away.
And Nick, you talked about a little bit about the collection process of waivers, health requirements, things of that nature. You want to kind of give a little more detail on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, before this year, a lot of that was really done on site when you would show up, right? You're signing the golf cart liability waiver or a health and safety waiver when you get on property. And really the ability to tie that into our credential workflow and have all of that documentation information signed off before anybody steps on property was just, it made life much easier. You didn't have to concern yourself with what locations you had to have those waivers and forms stationed at. So, and
that, I guess that transitioned to Peter Baranski at Travelers had a question, asked a few questions. They're all really good. And this is a little self-serving, so, but I appreciate it, Peter. How did you leverage the Lend platform to make things easier in 2021? And then how do you plan on using it differently in 2022?
You want to touch on the first part, Nick? I'll touch on the second.
Yeah, so the biggest change that we made this year was running all of our on-site credentialing through Lend. and really being able to tie in the process of collecting not only the name, but, you know, do these folks need meals each day to help us with our food and beverage counts at the different locations we had, you know, attaching that photo to the credential in the same system. For us in years past, it was a Google sheet that had all the names. It was a Dropbox folder that had all the photos, and it was trying to match that up. So, I mean, that process alone was saved hours and hours of time for Michelle and our team who oversees credentials. That was, in my mind, I mean, in a year where time was as valuable as it was,
Yeah, I mean,
that was
Nick's
a
point, we
huge
use it
improvement for us.
for credentialing all of our operational aspects, but the things that we're going to explore, and I know we're going to end up in a good place with it, is also utilizing Len for volunteer registration. Look at utilizing them for pro-am registration, also from basically a timeline planning and a checklist application as well. So those are the 4 things right now that we see that we're going to be utilizing Len for in 2022, above and beyond what we currently are.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really cool from my perspective to see all of those waivers and all of that in that dashboard, Nick, and having it automated for you. That was really awesome. And then Peter also asked, what were the biggest challenges COVID presented and what surprised you in that regard?
I think when it came, like, really, it comes down to actually like evac. So when we had our evac on Friday of the event, when it was hailing here in Southern California, unique, really having it to where we have the professional athletes and the professional caddies, and then you have it to where you have volunteers who are driving the evac vans, and we actually had to go as far as labeling them, the vans, differently, as these are for the pro caddies and for the professional athletes, and these vans are for the volunteers, right? So it was coming up with that actual on-site, coordination, ensuring that all those people had their masks on too, getting into the van. So if I think about one thing that COVID made challenging this year, it was actually the implementation of the evac plan.
Interesting.
And I would just back that up, and we've talked a lot about it so far, but the food and beverage was, in my mind as well, kind of the second biggest challenge. I mean, it's something that Andy and I came up with an idea, and we probably changed it 15 times between October and when the event actually went off. And it's, in terms of what the county was most concerned or worried about,
I
it was
think
really the
to
food
Nick's
and
point
beverage
on
plan
that
on
too
site.
is, we haven't touched on it, but we use contactless ordering for everything. We used a group called Tabio, and we used them for pay as you go. If you were a vendor, if you were a volunteer or a staffer, you could also use a voucher system through Tabio too. And so we implemented that throughout the event, which was new for us, and that's something that will also stick around, that we saw great success in.
And Peter also asked, what was the biggest operational challenge of having a pro-am?
So, you have it to where these individuals are paying $10,000 to play one round of golf with a professional athlete. And, the majority of that value is in actually playing golf, but there's a lot of other things that come with it, like a draw party, right? A pairings party to see which pro are you going to play with in your round the next day. Those individuals usually get to go to a post party after their round. They normally get to warm up on the driving range. They normally get to warm up on the practice putting green. So all of these things of value were stripped out of this experience. So it was trying to figure out, how do you offset that value? How do you at least maintain that price and still deliver to this client? One thing that we came up with, since they weren't able to use the driving range to warm up and to get those jitters out before they played with their pro that day, is that we worked with Full Swing, which is a simulator company. And they had a new product coming out that basically is a launch tracker, if you will. And we had them provide one of their large overall simulators and 6 of these launch trackers. And we actually set it up inside the Grand Ballroom at the Hilton, which is adjacent to the property here on Players Right of 18 Fairway. and we made a complete shift from these players coming in valeting, which you can't valet, right? So right now, you're currently under this tier. There's no valet allowed. So we had it to where they would come in, individually park at the Hilton and the Hilton's parking garage, and made their way to the ballroom of the Hilton. And we used these launch trackers and simulators to actually have them warm up for the competition. So that was a large change in regard to that experience for the Pro-Am.
Interesting. And Jen Hernandez asked, how will you use the data you collected from the event in future operational planning? I thought when we were talking about this earlier, it was pretty interesting.
I can go back to the players and the caddies. You have it to where so many people in the PGA Tour have a D on their badge, which means dining, or a C for caddy, and caddy allows you to have access to caddy dining. So for us, using that data collected for the first time, scanning those IDs, we can really see who ate in player dining, who ate in caddy dining, and when. We can see when they registered, so we can understand their flow on property. We can understand the tour's flow from a personnel standpoint, and that'll help us to figure out to be more optimal from a parking standpoint, from a food and beverage standpoint. So that's going to be great information that we've collected, and that we'll definitely use in future years.
And this is kind of, I don't know if it's a loaded question or not, but was it helpful that you had 11 months of being in COVID, or was that kind of just nerve-wracking and really, what was the feeling there?
I think in the beginning it was really nerve-wracking, but at the same time, grateful that we weren't the initial guinea pig. We've had a lot of people go through and do trial and error, and there was a lot of learnings from that. So it really set us up for success because we weren't out the door, and we saw what worked and what didn't work. So from that, I think it was better to be later in that 11-month run than in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I'll, Chris, just jump on the back of that and say, too, is, to Andy's point, the PGA Tour's program and plan was able to go through multiple renditions, make changes to it. And ultimately, by the time it got to us, it was great to have that template, because what we found was we had to make a lot of tweaks and adjustments to that overall plan to meet what the County of San Diego expected or required. And I know I chatted with you about this a little bit earlier, but just a small example. So the PGA Tour, all of their collateral at these other events from a temperature screening standpoint has been you have to screen at below 100.4 degrees. Well, in San Diego County, that's below 100.0 degrees. So changing all of that signage collateral that we ultimately had to produce, having that runway to make the changes we had to for San Diego County.
Yeah, and we actually got a question here from Barry Keane out of Ireland here. He asked, was the golfers' equipment subject to restrictions, for example, sanitizing clubs? Did it get down to that level? I'm sure the PGA Tour is the one who's really dictating that, but thought I'd ask.
So from a golf club standpoint, I mean, that onus is on the players and the caddy, but it did from a driving range standpoint. The golf balls, the range balls, the practice balls, those actually had to go through a different process of cleaning with a certain solution, because all of those balls on the range, based on what company, whether it's Titleist or Bridgestone, Strixon, so certain players use certain balls, but they all had to be sanitized in the same way, just so you had so many different people touching them. So
interesting. Well,
and another one that goes along with that, Chris, is on a typical year, if a player gets a package shipped to Torrey Pines, we take that package and we take it directly to the locker room. We put it in that individual's locker. We actually had to stand up basically an equipment distribution center this year to where any package that was shipped to Torrey Pines for a player could no longer go directly to the locker room. It had to go to this distribution center where it was sanitized, disinfected, and the players actually had to go to that location to pick up whether it was their, balls, gloves, clubs, all of that equipment had to go through that as opposed
and there
to
was
directly to their
there was some
locker.
pain in that, right? Because it still has to go through the security process. So you would have a player or an agent manager receive notification that, hey, this package has showed up. Well, yeah, the package is here, but now that process was so much longer that sometimes it would take an hour and a half, 2 hours to go through security and then get moved to the other tent, sanitized and then ready for distribution. So there was some frustration with people like, hey, I need this package right now. And it's like, well, we can't give you this package right now.
So in terms of 2022, Lend, a shipping receiving program protocol is
I
another
like
one
it.
we'll be
I like it.
out.
Well, yeah, before I wrap up, and I don't want to speak for you guys, but, obviously a ton of knowledge coming off of, less than a week ago. You mentioned being available for some of the folks on here if they ever have any questions. Yeah, you want to speak to that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. We're here to help in any way we can. So we're happy to share the knowledge that we've learned from this event. So if anyone wants to reach out directly, we're here for you. We're open to any questions.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah. And before I wrap it up, one, the system automatically records these, so we'll be making this available, and feel free to share it with whomever. As always, we always do this and have done in the past, but if you have any suggestions for interviews, there's some other amazing folks on here as well. I'd love to, schedule something with you all. So if you do, send me those emails. But Andy and Nick, I really appreciate you taking the time. Absolutely, always our conversations are always incredible, and I love that you're willing to share the knowledge. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for always keeping us in mind. Appreciate it.
You got it.